Okay, so this video is going to get into more detail where I'm just going to focus on one specific sort of technique that I've kind of referenced in a few classes and tutorials, but that's working with halftone dots and actually working with real vector halftone dots. You might be familiar with this. It kind of is used in kind of retro type comic book fills or whatever, but halftone dots can be a really interesting effect that you can use to create a gradient with a much more coarse dot or more open screen that kind of recreates that old school analog halftone photographic process. If you've looked around RF stock, you can see that there's a whole bunch of kind of pre-built halftones and things like that, but really you don't need to use those. You can actually build super customized halftone dot patterns in Adobe Illustrator directly and pretty fluidly, pretty interactively, but it does take a few steps. So what I've got here is I've put together a few different examples, and I'm going to kind of show how I work with them interactively. And there's sort of a little bit of a challenge with them. So in terms of how you get these initially. So all of these halftone dots are using the effect called under the Photoshop effects, Pixelate color halftone. So to really get a good effect with this, you really need to understand how this filter works with your color swatch library and how it behaves kind of differently depending on how you've defined your color swatches. So I'm just going to use an example here of a default shape just filled with a standard linear radial fill, circular radial gradient fill. And I've made a couple of different versions of it where they all kind of look sort of the same, but I've used different colors of black, so different ways of producing a black. So the one way we can make a black is just a process black where cyan, magenta, and yellow are all set to 0, and only the black is set to 100%. And it uses a process color, and it's a global checked. Another way we can make a black color, sometimes referred to as a rich black, is 100% black with a various mix of cyan, magenta, and yellow. I've just set them all to 100% here. On screen they essentially look the same. They don't look any different. And then the third way is a spot color black, which is now just going to treat, Illustrator is just going to treat that as a single channel. And each of these interacts differently with the same filter. I'm going to go through and show how each one works differently, so I think it'll make it kind of clear how the filter is applied. So I've got this shape here, and in my appearance panel I've turned off the color halftone. So I'm just going to enable it. So if you were working with your default color palette, which would have sort of process color blacks, typically default set to global, you're going to get a result with the halftone filter that's kind of like this. It might be kind of what you're going for, but it's a little messy. It doesn't have the clean dot pattern. Here's kind of my finished target result that I want. I'm going to just go to outline mode. You can see, here I've got a nice actual vector shape that's a compound path that actually has all the dots that I can really work with. Where on the left, if I just apply the filter on the appearance panel only, it's kind of like a JPEG. It's got the opaque background, and I can't really do much with it. So it feels a little limiting to start with, and with the default settings turned on, it kind of is. So when I'm going to the color halftone settings in the filter, when you first apply the color halftone Pixelate filter, it'll give you a max radius, which is the maximum size of the dot in the halftone pattern that it generates, and then an angle for each of the colors. So in a 4-color process, you've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And there's different angles that are used, but those angles come together to form the rose patterns that you see if you look at a CMYK printed image with a loop, which if you were to print out a 300 dpi CMYK black to gray sort of faded gradient and looked at it up close, it would look something like this. The filter does a pretty accurate job of adjusting that. So you can mess around with the angles and things like that, but if you want to clean it up so that you just get one angle, there's a couple of different things that you can do, but I'm going to just show here how it changes just by changing what swatch I apply to it. Okay, so I've got 100% black only. If I click that and I change the fill to just that gradient, you can see it's gotten rid of all the other colors and it's just showing the black dots, 45 degrees. And really all I've done is, the filter setting is exactly the same. Nothing's changed here. 40 pixels, 131, 50, 90, 45. But all the other colors have disappeared because the swatch that I've used to build the gradient is the process black that just has only black in it. So 0% for the first 3 channels, 100% for that one. So typically that's what you're going to want to use to build your gradient shapes in using your to get that nice halftone shape. You're not limited to using gradients. You can apply that filter to blends. These are 3 shape blends that I've done. So same thing. All you're doing here is just starting with your process black, which just has a single channel, and then just going to white, object, blend, make, and then effect, apply color halftone. And there you go. You've got your nice custom dot pattern. And you can kind of really customize this real time before you need to turn it into a vector shape. So you can really fine tune all the details of your blends. You can really customize the way that those blends work together. It's not super instantaneous. You got to let the filter kind of do its job. But all of these shapes are live blends. So when I go to outline mode, just those 2 shapes blended. So you can really use those to customize and shape how your halftone dot pattern goes. So the third sort of scenario here, and it's kind of like it creates the opposite, is if you use a global spot color in your gradient, and it doesn't really matter if you apply it to a blend or a gradient. I'll just use this square one here that I did. I'm going to double click into isolation mode. Instead of starting with process black, I'm going to go to the spot black. So the difference is subtle, but when you use a spot color, Illustrator applies the filter in a slightly different way. The dots, the white or the negative space become the circles, and sort of the screened part becomes the color. So it's a subtle difference. It changes the way that halftone works, and there's different ways that there's different times where you might want your halftone to look that way. So if you want the dots to be the dark color, the positive color, then you need to use a process swatch. And you can apply it like that, and it'll reapply. You can see how those, now the dots are black and the spaces are white. Most of the time that's what we're going for when we're using this as an overlay or a shape, a set of shapes or a compound path within our illustration. But both are available, and there's 2 linear gradients built exactly the same way. One just using the process color at the beginning of the gradient, and the other one using the spot color at the beginning of the gradient. And you can do that with any color as well. If I were to go in and apply, just take this and take one of my spot greens, like let's just see this evergreen color here. Let that apply. You can see that that's going to go there. So if you want color halftones before you convert to vector, that's one way to do it, but you're always going to get the reverse pattern before you get your result. If you go and use a process color, you're going to get the mix of the cyan, magenta, and yellow in the filter. So it's not super clear there because I guess yellow doesn't show up so well, but I'll load up close because that's, obviously got a mix of cyan, or actually it's got 100% yellow and 100% cyan. That's going to give you that kind of overlaid transparency gradient. So that's not always going to work so good for the next step here in terms of what I want to do to get my compound path shape. So the next step, how do we get from this filter applied appearance to a compound path that I can apply my spot colors to, transparency, all those sort of things? Pretty straightforward process. The first thing you do is you select your shape that you're happy with. Could be any one of these. Going to go to Object, and we're going to go Expand Appearance. So what that's effectively done is rasterized your effect into a flat placed image. So then our next step then is Image Trace, and you can just go Make and Expand. So now that's gone through and created a big group of a bunch of different shapes. But we want to convert that to a compound path. So we're going to double click into this group. We're going to click, just the white. We're going to go select same fill color. That's going to select all the white. And if you want to keep that background, you can Control X to cut it or just delete it. Depends if you want to use it or not. But I'm going to now paste it. And there we go. We've got our vector shape, which is the negative space, sort of the mask, I guess you could look at it as. But then also our compound path. But right now this is just a group of a whole bunch of shapes, and we want to make that into a nice, easy to work with compound path in our layer structure, because this would obviously be real messy. But Control 8 converts that to a compound path that we can now just work with nice and easy. You can do the same with the negative space if you want to. That's not often as useful, but you can kind of do fun things by overlaying it like a mask or whatever. So once you're at this point, you've got two vector shapes, but typically when I'm working with it, I just delete that background shape. So you can see my compound path right there, and now I can work with it with my various swatch colors and overlay it with other graphics, scale it, do all that wonderful stuff that Illustrator is meant to do, and still have that real custom halftone dot interaction and graphic that's scalable and clean. It's not going to make perfect dots. If you zoom in close, you're going to see that it's got some of these little teardrop shapes, but those are all pretty good. If you're going to do something really large scale and you really need to fix it, well then you probably want to manually go through and replace those with little perfect circles. But for the most part, most of these shapes are pretty good, and they have a really nice chunky halftone dot effect that works as a proper vector that you can use everywhere. So I encourage you to play around with that and have some fun with it. Think about how you can create different shapes with blends, and then apply the filter. Change the dot size when you're applying the filter to see how that changes the effect. And once you're happy with it, go through that sort of three-step process to expand the appearance, image trace it, ungroup it, get rid of the stuff you don't need, and then convert to a compound path, and you're good to go.